Hi y'all, welcome to my shop. It's important for wood turners to be familiar with the different chucking techniques because different projects call for different chucking solutions. And today we're going to talk about the wood screw and how it differs between its close cousin, the woodworm screw, which we talked about in an earlier video. I'll have a link here, and I'll also have one in the show notes. That earlier video I did on the woodworm screw was getting a little bit long, so I didn't have a chance to cover all the information that I wanted to cover on screw chuck, so I decided to make that a separate video. But the woodworm screw is generally used for larger projects, such as shown here, typically bowls and platters, whereas the wood screw is used in a somewhat similar fashion, but for smaller projects. Like the woodworm screw, threads tend to hold better in side grain, that is bowl orientation, than in end grain. And one of the advantages of both the woodworm screw and the screw chuck is that you can tend to unthread your project and thread it back on, and it'll run true. So that's a good advantage to the wood screw. Even if you make a wood screw out of a very large lag bolt, it's generally not going to be as good for large projects because it's not going to hold as well as a woodworm screw. But it is a fast chucking technique because you can just grab this thing, thread it on your chuck, and you'd use the size screw that would be appropriate for the kind of project that you're going to be using. Similar to a woodworm screw, you're generally not going to use a screw chuck for very soft, punky wood where the threads could strip out. You don't want to use it if there's an uneven face on the project. In Chattanooga at the symposium, I ran into my friend Art Leastman, who's selling these cool t-shirts. He gave me this one. I'll have a link, if you're interested, I'll have a link to his site where you can buy this shirt and some other designs in different colors, and it'll be in the show notes underneath the description. So let's kind of do a comparison. For the woodworm screw versus the screw chuck, both share the advantage of being a very quick way to mount a blanket that provides a chucking method that does not require tailstock support, even though you're always going to use tailstock support for as often as you can and as long as you can, only remove it when you need to. Secondly, in mounting, a woodworm screw is going to require a chuck because the woodworm screw comes with a chuck and it's got those very, very thin screw threads that screw in to help hold. Whereas a screw chuck, you're going to have you're going to use generally a commercial screw that threads are not nearly as fine nor as deep. The screw chuck is generally going to require either a dedicated faceplate, or you're going to, as in this case, use a threaded glue block, which is a very convenient way of being able to have even different sizes, different size screws, and it just threads on and it registers and will run. If you build it properly, it will run true every time. It's very convenient. There are differences in screw size. Typically in a woodworm screw, as we talked in that earlier video, tends to be somewhere in the area of close to a ½ inch in diameter, whereas the wood screw, you're going to have something, depending on it's going to be based on your project, but normally you don't find commercial screws nearly as large as the woodworm screw, and even if you did, the threads aren't going to be cut that fine. But you can make them out of lag bolts, and I think if for larger projects, a 3/8 inch lag bolt can work fairly well, although for that size project, I would tend to use a woodworm screw, and I tend to use screw chucks for smaller projects, and we'll talk more about specific examples in a moment. Now, there are commercial screw chucks as shown here that will, as opposed to a commercial screw that you'd pick up at the hardware store or home development store, it's going to have deeper cut threads that are going to look a lot closer to what you'd look like in your screw chuck. The screw is still going to be smaller, but it generally comes with a dedicated faceplate mechanism to hold it. Both techniques require sound wood. As I mentioned in a previous video, sometimes you can salvage if the wood's a little soft, not punky, because punky is not, you're not going to get good results. But if it's a little bit soft, maybe just a softer wood, you can put in a few drops of thin CA and let it harden, and that might help. In some instances, you can actually put some CA on the threads and thread it on. You'll still be able to break it off, but it will tend to help hold it. Both the Woodworm screw and the wood screw share similar shortcuts in that they are best suited for side grain rather than end grain. Although the smaller projects you can get away with end grain, as I'll show you in just a moment. They can both work if the project is not so long as that there's just too much leverage that will cause it to pull out. Neither are going to work real well in a very soft wood. If the screws strip out, generally you're toast. With a Woodworm screw, you don't have too many alternatives. In a screw chuck, you might be able to drill a larger hole and go to a larger screw chuck, but generally that's not going to be suitable for your project. So generally, if you strip it out, you're toast. So let me show you some examples of how I use a screw chuck, and of course it's only subject to your imagination and the kind of project you do. The first method, way I use a screw chuck is if I'm turning knobs, because screw chucks are a very fast way to do production turning on the same kind of project over and over and over. For example, in this cabinet I made over here, it's got, I think, 19 knobs. So you want a fast, easy way to chuck. So a screw chuck gives you that way to quickly drill a hole and thread it on. A production technique is you can size the base and have it elevated a little bit, and you can actually let me do a close-up here. So for example, for knobs, when you make your screw chuck, you could use make a raised area that matches the size of the tenon. So instead of having to caliper it and constantly check on it, this is not a good example because it doesn't match it. But as soon as your project, you get it round and it matches that little mini tenon you've got, you know you're at the right size and you can stop, and that works very well on a lot of these little projects. This one's probably a little better example. The other reason you could have a tenon on it, a very tiny, might say a micro. I say a tenon. It's just a little elevated area. That if your project call for rounding over the bottom, for example, you could have that elevated tenon and have it a little bit smaller than your project and still give room to get in there with a spindle gouge or a detail gouge to deal with those edges and round it over. The thin thread form on the Woodworm screw, as well as the screw chuck, is specifically designed to cause minimal damage to wood fibers as it threads on, and they grip better than screws with thicker threads. For example, this lag bolt, because there's a larger volume of undamaged wood retained within the screw. I would consider a screw chuck generally suitable for smaller projects than a Woodworm screw can handle. You drill a hole and the mandrel would be self-tapping for the wood, typically. If you were using for acrylic, you'd probably be better off using a separate tap to cut the threads rather than just thread it on. Now, DIY chucks like this can be very handy for specialized work. Let me show you an example. Now, one of the beauties of a screw chuck, if you don't have a chuck, you can actually make a screw chuck, as I showed earlier, that uses a faceplate, or you can get a tap and you can tap wooden blocks. But you can also use a chuck, and I use the chuck because it's fast and easy way to make these mandrels, and I use a bunch of these in a project where I'm using these for turning chessmen. So I have a bunch of them, and again here shows the example of where I've got a tenon that I can help use to size the piece. So The what I call a screw mandrel, is a variation of the screw chuck. Still uses a screw, still uses a plate, but I add additional strength by drilling a hole that will keep the thing a little more stable as well. And this works great for projects such as chessmen. It makes it very easy to drill a hole, thread it on. Again, when you can use this tenon to size the base, and when you get them to match, boom, you're done. If you're a visitor, I would very much appreciate you making a specific comment below as to what you got out of this video. If you like this one, you might want to watch my video on actually how to make a screw chuck. Also want to thank my supporters who've bought me a virtual cup of coffee. Y'all stay safe. Come on back here.